In this chapter, chapter 5, we will discuss Jewish Americans of European descent. So a question to ask yourself is, who is Jewish and where are they? There are relatively small Jewish communities with national origins in Iran, Syria, North Africa, and non-European areas of Russia. There are also small groups of African American, Latino, Latina, and Asian Jews. In terms of oppression, Jews might be regarded as the most widely oppressed racial ethnic group in world history. In terms of migration, there were more push factors for the Jews to leave areas in Europe. From 1500 to World War II, early immigrants came to the Atlantic coast seeking economic opportunities denied them in Europe. Morenos was a derogatory term used towards Jews who were forced to convert publicly to Christianity during the Spanish Inquisition under the threat of death, but who privately maintained allegiance to Judaism. So to survive, they put on a guise that they're Christian, but in their practices, they still practice Judaism. Central European Jews came to the U.S. after 1820. Other types of discrimination that Jews faced came from pogroms. These are organized, often officially encouraged attacks on Jews, similar to mobs, and this contributed to a lot of outmigration or push factors for Jews to leave. In terms of our own country, the U.S., President Franklin Roosevelt's administration permitted modest increases in Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. More than 400,000 slots within U.S. immigration for refugees from countries under Nazi control were not used. And some of these unfilled slots probably represented lives lost to extermination by the Nazis because of discriminatory U.S. immigration policies. So again, that's 400,000 lives lost because of policies that are discriminatory. Next, moving on from World War II to the present, Jewish migration tapered after the 1940s, so after World War II, and by the 1970s, however, Israeli immigrants were coming and arriving in the U.S. Also, since the 1960s, a new group of Eastern European Jews has been immigrating to the U.S. from the former Soviet Union, now known as Russia. And many have immigrated because of resurgence of anti-Semitism, and this is hate towards Jews and social chaos in Russia. The National Jewish Population Survey, or NJPS, found that current Jewish American population is about 5.2 million, and Jewish Americans represent a large proportion of the world's Jewish population. Today, the Jewish Americans are about 2% of the U.S. population. And areas that we see a large number of Jews are in large metropolitan areas like New York, northern New Jersey, Los Angeles, Riverside, and Orange counties, and Miami, Florida, Lauderdale areas. So in terms of prejudice and stereotypes, the reason why I have this particular image up is because in terms of stereotypes, Jews are known for supposedly having larger noses. But in realistic sense, though, they don't look any different than most European Americans. However, Jewish Americans are socially defined by non-Jewish outsiders on the basis of physical and cultural characteristics. Non-Jews in many countries have considered Jews to be biologically inferior race. So Today, they're considered mostly by most as white. In previous times, again, they're seen as a separate race, and this shows again how race is socially constructed, how we can pick certain groups to be white or non-white. Anti-Semitism, again, is stereotyping of, prejudice toward, or discrimination against Jews in particular. And theology has contributed to anti-Semitism. So in some Christian denominations, Jews are considered Christ killers. And another stereotype that's often given to Jews is that they are devious. So unlike African, Native, or Latino or Latin Americans, Jews are often stereotyped as intelligent. Others are seen as unintelligent. And often Jews are seen as crafty or trying to plot against other groups. And this stereotype was developed to rationalize the success of Jews. So how are they doing so well? Well, it's because they are crafty, they're devious. During the 1800s, the Jews were excluded from many organizations and institutions. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was created by Russian secret police and showed Jews as anti-Christian agents, taking covert control of the world and destroying Western civilization. So again, they're seen as outsiders, wanting to hurt or to destroy other groups. So more about anti-Semitism. Various forms of anti-Semitism persist in the U.S. and Europe. In an opinion poll, 1/4 of U.S. respondents blamed the Jews, at least in a moderate amount, for the 2009 financial crisis. Supposedly all the Jews control the banks. And we also see anti-Semitism in Hollywood film, in particular Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, show that Jewish groups were responsible for killing Christ. If you read the Bible, though, however, you'll see that the practice of crucifixion is Roman, and if the Jews did kill Christ, more likely Jesus Christ would have been stoned. So in retaliation or opposition to the movie, Jewish groups protested because movies portrayed Jews as primarily and collectively responsible for the death of Jesus. And Jewish Americans are singled out by the religious right as the most Jewish Americans single out the religious Christian right as the most anti-Semitic group. Other types of oppression and conflict that Jews faced, again, particular hate crimes. More than 100 anti-Semitic organizations between 1932 and 1941 have been recorded. Increased anti-Semitism in Germany, and it was an important factor for the rising number of Nazi attacks against Jewish Americans. And violent attacks on Jewish Americans and their property in synagogues was common after World War II. The Anti-Defamation League, ADL, receives reports of anti-Semitism, and they see that the number of hate crimes by skinheads has grown, and even in recent years. So what is a hate crime? A hate crime is defined as crimes against people and property generated by prejudice against racial, ethnic, religious, disability, or sexual orientation groups. And recently more than 40 legislatures have passed hate crime laws. Numerous state legislatures have increased penalties for crimes involving racial or ethnic hatred. And the Hate Crimes Prevention Act was introduced in 1999 and passed 10 years later in 2009. And then this act is a comprehensive federal approach to hate crimes, and it's supported by Jews and other civil rights groups. So Jews in America face various forms of religious discrimination and conflict, and federal courts have periodically dealt with religious discrimination. Jewish business owners contested blue laws, and because most businesses are required to close on Sunday, which is usually a day of Sabbath for Christian groups. However, that is not a day of Sabbath for Jews. It's Saturday. So back to blue laws. However, the argument that these laws violated the First Amendment rights of Jews was not to be penalized for religion was unsuccessful. In 1986, the Supreme Court said the U.S. Air Force could require an Orthodox rabbi chaplain to remove a yarmulke, the head covering, when indoors. So again, taking off religious garb, part of your identity, for various reasons, including work. Just think about that. Would you take off something that's part of your identity for a job when it's not part of your job, official job requirements? So Jewish and Black communities have worked together for a long time in American history. They have helped each other. However, these groups also have had periodic times of conflict. In the 1960s and the more recent urban rebellions, we see that there's more conflict there. There's the controversy between Jews and Blacks in New York City, which has gained media attention. And this could be because Black people see Jews as white and gaining privileges from their whiteness, whereas Jewish people see themselves as more of an oppressed group because of their religious identity. We also see that Black anti-Semitism and criticism of Israeli treatment of Palestinians have alienated many Jewish Americans from participating in intergroup coalitions. And as we know, there's been historic hostility between Palestinians and Israelis in the Middle East. So Letty Pogrebin says that reasons for continuing tensions between Jews and Blacks is this: differences between Blacks and Jews are rarely more obvious than when each group speaks about its own survival. A word that both use frequently, but with quite similar meanings. Blacks worry about their actual conditions and fear for the present. Jews worry about their history and fear for the future. But still, Jewish people still fight for civil rights. Tensions between Jewish and African Americans have not substantially affected Jewish commitment to civil rights. Today, many Jewish individuals and organizations strongly support Black civil rights causes and communities. In recent decades, Black and Jewish citizens have entered into numerous dialogues in order to seek ways to ease tensions between the two traditional allies in the struggle for civil rights. So some contemporary issues that Jewish people are concerned about. One is the survival of Israel and Jewish American pressure to mobilize our positive relationship with Israel. And we see that Jewish organizations and individuals are opposed to political candidates who support Middle Eastern policies hostile to Israel. Some organizations work to eliminate all racial prejudice and discrimination and ensure separation of church and state. So that includes Christian and Jewish places of worship. Jews are one of the most affluent of all white ethnic groups. And this might be expected to develop the orientation of other high-income white groups, but their experiences with discrimination have tended to keep them more liberal. So instead of completely assimilating, as we see with that list of 7 types of assimilation by Morton, we see that Jews don't feel like they're completely assimilated because they still feel discriminated against, that they're different than other white ethnic groups. So in terms of the economy, Jewish immigrants have contributed to the prosperity of North America from colonial times. We see this as an example from Hayam Solomon. He financed the American Revolution with a loan to the struggling government. So here's a Jewish person giving a loan to our government to finance the American Revolution. So we see that we talk about patriotism and support for America. Here's a prime example from the Jewish community. Success in commercial pursuits in Europe made them scapegoats for the non-Jewish poor. So again, we project our fears, angers, or resentments towards other groups, and since the Jews were so successful, they were the target. Discrimination in North America fostered an ethnic economy in which Jews relied on economic aid from one another. So there's, again, those large cities, ethnic enclaves, and one in particular is for Jewish people, and so they supported each other by providing jobs where otherwise they would be shut out from in other areas. Jewish people are considered a middleman minority. This is a place in terms of jobs. In early 1900s, more than a third of Eastern European Jews were employed in the garment industry, so making clothing. Second generation were encouraged to enter white-collar professions, so we see some economic social mobility here. Jewish women contributed significantly to family incomes, so they weren't your typical well-to-do stay-at-home moms. 1 in 3 Jewish households had a woman working outside the home, and often they joined their husbands in small retail shops that supplied many neighborhoods, so again working for these ethnic enclaves. Jewish Americans are considered part of the middleman minority, and so what this means is that they have many privileges that groups considered white have, but also don't have all of them. They are still facing oppression in various ways, so they're somewhere in the middle. So the rate of penetration of new immigrant groups into the core economy depends on its economic background as well as the conditions at point of destination. So we already know that most Jewish immigrants were doing okay financially, so they were able to move into that middleman position. The next large group of Jewish immigrants was poor and poorly educated, so they did not have those resources. Experience of coping with oppression in Europe provided them, however, with strategies for finding economic niches. So because they knew how to survive in a place where they're persecuted, once they came to the U.S., they used those skills to help themselves. And often in these jobs for these type of immigrants, they worked in low-wage labor. That's men, women, and children. So from the Depression, 1920s to 1950, we see definite anti-Semitism occurring in this country. Solidarity of Jewish American community and heavy involvement in small and medium-sized businesses were sources of survival during the Great Depression. Again, the Great Depression affected everyone from every group. But if you were a part of a non-dominant group, you're affected in particular ways. Jewish ethnic economy provided a fallback position for those who face discrimination. Again, there are signs put up, applications say do not apply if you were Jewish, and so again they had to rely on one another, these ethnic niches, to help each other economically. So in terms of job clustering, we have to get past the stereotype that Jews control the banks. It's not true. That's an obsession of anti-Semites. There's actually few Jewish Americans in banking and in finance. We see Jews overrepresented in just a few sectors, that being clothing, textiles, and movies. And one of the movies that we watched was Schindler's List, directed by Spielberg here, and he is a Jewish man. Clustering patterns of Jews in certain industries reflected the extent to which Jewish workers were forced to work outside of mainstream businesses. So after the war, various jobs they can go into, but again, they faced tremendous employment discrimination. So again, these job advertisements included anti-Jewish restrictions, and employment agencies discriminated against Jews. Yet Jewish Americans were able to share in the post-war prosperity. And they were able to do that by going to new industries such as television and plastics. So they saw an opening and went through that door. Current Jewish Americans still say that they're facing discrimination. And in 2009, ASAJO survey found that anti-Semitism is still a problem in the U.S. and overseas. And nearly half of the respondents believe anti-Semitism will increase in the future. Anti-Semitism keeps many Jewish Americans from full social recognition and political power. So again, full assimilation is not happening. In 1985, New York City finally passed laws banning anti-Jewish and other discrimination in private clubs. In 1992, bills were passed banning discrimination in private country clubs in the state of New York and private clubs in the state of Florida. And again, these two areas are highly populated with Jewish Americans. In terms of the social institution of education, we can see that Jews are doing very well. Education became more of a priority for later groups than earlier ones. Again, the earlier ones were immigrants and trying to just survive, whereas younger generations have more ability to do well educationally. Significant participation in public schools came with a surge of Eastern European immigrants for whom secular education was a means to becoming American. So again, this is a way to either you can say acculturate, which is forced assimilation, or to choose to assimilate to become like an American to get those privileges of whiteness. Eastern European immigrants established numerous schools that taught Jewish religious practices to ensure U.S.-born retained their ethnic and religious identity. So here we see pluralism happening with two of these two different cultures, American, and then we have Jewish coming together and practiced. Education mobility came swiftly for second and third generation Jewish Americans. This is not to say that Jewish were not discriminated in terms of education. There were discriminatory quotas for Jewish students. Progress in higher education Progress in higher education was countered by discrimination on the part of Anglo-Protestant whites. There were restrictive quotas imposed at numerous colleges and universities from the 1920s to 1950s. And we have seen in history that Jews were often excluded from teaching positions. We see now that there's more Jewish people in higher positions in education, and that's due to increased college enrollments after World War II that created a demand for college teachers. The proportion of Jewish faculty increased to 9%, only 9% by 1970s. So we see continuing increases in education or achievements in education. We see severe anti-Jewish discrimination declining after World War II. and educational attainment is being reached at higher levels. Schooling and Jewish religion and culture also persists, so we have Jewish programs, Jewish schools, to make sure that that culture is authentic. We have emphasis on learning heritage and religion in lower grades and how that has carried on over even to college. 41% of current Jewish college students and graduate students have taken a Jewish studies class. Next, we're going to talk about religion and Zionism. The role of Judaism and Jewish identity is a point of conflict between established German Jews and later Eastern European immigrants. German Jews saw themselves as Americans whose religion was Judaism, whereas Eastern Europeans had strong desire to maintain old ethnic identity. Conservative Judaism began in the 1880s, and the authority of the rabbi and rituals became less important over time. So in terms of trends of religious practices and identity, we see expanding suburbanization after World War II, and this brought an increase in suburban congregations. Jewish American religion currently reflects interest in traditional heritage, maintenance of synagogues as community centers, and home religious practices. Judaism is now one of the major U.S. religions, and there's different types of Judaism, major groups: Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and Reform Judaism. Some call much of contemporary Judaism a cardiac religion, emphasizing heart or ethics rather than traditional ritual and doctrine. Some say that because of intermarriage, the authenticity of the Jewish culture has declined in the U.S. So again, it's opposed by some Jewish Americans. It is seen to have threatened the survival of the Jewish community. However, intermarriage has increased with each successive generation. Speculation on whether Jews will eventually disappear as the rate of intermarriage is increasing is unknown. Some intermarried couples have embraced Judaism, so choosing that to raise their families in. And mid-2000s ASAJO survey showed Jews not concerned that intermarriage is destroying the Jewish identity. They are, however, more concerned over external threats than internal threats of intermarriage. So now talking about recent immigrants, social and economic adjustment of more recent Jewish immigrants raises issues concerning assimilation and the U.S. culture. Close ties between Israel and the U.S. make Israeli immigration relatively easy. Israelis often come with professional or managerial experience and have more economic success, so they have resources that make their assimilation easier. Many Russian Jews, however, have reported some difficulty adapting to U.S. culture. So what does it mean to be Jewish today? Scholars stress that the U.S. society, all Jews are Jews by choice. This view is exaggerated, but does indicate the degree of change since intense anti-Semitism of early to middle 20th century has declined. From an ethnogenesis perspective, it recognizes the reality of cultural differences among contemporary ethnic groups, and this can help us interpret the Jewish experience better. Sociologist Sylvia Barak-Fishman described Jewish pattern of adaptation to core culture as coalescence. Liberal American social and political values held by most American Jews have come to be seen as simply Jewish values. Herbert Gaines argues that Jewish identity is a symbolic ethnicity without lasting significance. Jewish history professor Robert Wolfe argues that the danger of Anglo-conformity assimilation is actually assimilation to Christian culture. Some Jewish American leaders expressed concern over changes at voluntary organization levels. Jewish philanthropic and service agencies face a decline in private and government support. American Jews with a weak sense of identity may not support these organizations. Recent surveys found that most still seek and still have substantial connections to Jewish culture and communities. Jews remain significantly differentiated in identity, history, and experience from other white Americans. Again, they're seen as a middleman minority. Jewish social scientist Karen Rockin argues that many American Jews worked hard to be accepted as white. They moved into suburbs, changed their names, or underwent cosmetic surgery to assimilate better. Eric Goldstein, in The Price of Whiteness, contends that Jewish Americans sought acceptance and privileges as whites by conforming strongly to pre-existing white Protestant values, again assimilating by religion. Both show how Jewish Americans have become comfortable with the group moved to embrace white privilege given their long history of fighting racial and ethnic oppression. Two different theoretical perspectives to explain experiences of Jewish Americans. One is the Anglo-conformity perspective. It says this is a dominant perspective among Jewish Americans. And next is the cultural pluralism approach. And this is favored by certain Jewish leaders since 1800s. Again, this is having two cultures living in the same geographical area